Good morning, everyone. I'm Emily Actrizandi, Managing Director of Atlantic Live, and welcome to the Next Drugs, an Atlantic policy update on biosimilars. This is our third and final event in our series on biosimilars. The Food and Drug Administration defines a biosimilar as a drug that is, quote, highly similar to an FDA-approved biological product and has no clinically meaningful differences in terms of safety and effectiveness from the original product. The worldwide market for these drugs is big and getting bigger, estimated to hit somewhere between $25 to $35 billion by 2020. Switching to these drugs from the biological therapies they are modeled off of has the potential to save our health system tens of billions of dollars. But many issues remain, including the FDA approval of these copies, though not exact replicas, of biologic pharmaceuticals. This conversation isn't a static one. A patent case in front of the Supreme Court and laws making their way through Congress have the potential to change the market and industry. So we clearly have a lot to talk about today. I'd like to thank the Biosimilars Council for making today's event possible. The Council is a division of the Association for Accessible Medicines. And with that, I'm delighted to welcome the association's President and Chief Executive Officer, Chip Davis Jr., who is here to say a few words. Chip, welcome to the stage.
Emily, thank you. Good morning, everybody. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. All right, now, come on, it's biosimilars, let's go. On behalf of the Biosimilars Council, I want to thank all of you for being with us here this morning, those of you physically in the room and those of you who are participating online through the live stream. It's great to see, as Emily said, this is the third in the series, so it's very nice to look out and see some familiar faces in the room, as well as many new ones. From the last two policy briefings that we had in the Next Drug series. The Atlantic team actually was joking with us as we were preparing for this the other day that these events have cultivated a die-hard biosimilars following. Many of you, if you recall, we had a pretty mild winter here in Washington, D.C., except for one day. And that one day was the same day as the first event in this series. So a lot of people were good enough to brave through that snowstorm to attend the first briefing. But all kind of kidding and weather issues aside, we take everyone's continued interest in biosimilars and these briefings very seriously, and we think they reflect an important indication of the need to keep engaging and educating stakeholders across the healthcare ecosystem on important issues relative to ensuring a robust pathway for these medicines. In fact, today's panels will touch on some particularly timely and salient issues for all biosimilar stakeholders, from restricted access drug programs that result in fewer affordable options for patients, efforts within Congress, such as Congressman Welch's leadership in being the lead sponsor of the Fast Generics Act, and you'll hear from him momentarily, to address those types of abuses, to the impending Supreme Court decision that Emily referenced in Amgen v. Sandoz, and how that will impact the emerging biosimilars marketplace. In fact, interestingly, since our last briefing in March, one more biosimilar has been approved by the FDA, and so we have now a total of 5 approvals in the U.S. market, although only 2 are on the market due to ongoing litigation. So the good news is we're making progress, but we are still far behind our colleagues in Europe. These ongoing regulatory and policy considerations on biosimilars development, including what stakeholders anticipate biosimilars can expect when it comes to patents and exclusivity issues, and the future of the biosimilars debate and how it may play out from the Supreme Court to the impact of that decision in the marketplace, are all issues that the Biosimilars Council and its members, who are manufacturers and stakeholder organizations working to develop these products, are following and engaging in very closely. And we will be fortunate enough to hear from many experts who will be joining us for this session this morning. As was said, this is the third event in the Atlantic's Politics and Policy Briefing Series that's being supported by the Biosimilars Council. But it is our hope, as the Biosimilars Council and overall as the Association for Accessible Medicines, that this is simply the end of the beginning of a much-needed dialogue with all of you here today. And we look forward to continuing these discussions as the biosimilars market continues to grow and develop. In fact, I would be remiss not to mention the fact that we have an upcoming conference this fall entitled Leading on Biosimilars that will be hosted by the Biosimilars Council and will convene industry leaders, FDA officials, patient and consumer advocates, clinicians, and other marketplace experts. And that will take place here in Washington on September 12th and 13th. You can find out more about that conference by visiting the Council website at www.biosimilarscouncil.org. And we hope to see all of you at the conference in September. Finally, for those of you who are looking for even more information and relevant data on biosimilars, please make sure as you exit, if you didn't get it on your way in, that you grab a hold of the packet of information of council materials that was just outside the door. In addition to information about the Biosimilars Council, you'll find several new educational resources that we are sharing for the first time today, including some relevant new information contained in a study on REMS. And it also includes a biosimilars fact sheet and infographics on breaking down the barriers that have constituted some of the challenges with making sure that the biosimilars that have been approved are getting to the market. In addition, there's a myth versus facts infographic that addressed some common misperceptions about biosimilars. We hope that you use these materials. We hope that you find them helpful as you continue to learn more about the promise of the emerging biosimilars marketplace that will enable patients to have access to safe, affordable, and life-saving medicines that they richly deserve. So once again, on behalf of the Biosimilars Council, thank you to the Atlantic, and thank you to all of you for being here today for this important discussion in this forum. And I'll turn it back over to Emily. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Chip. Before we get going, a few quick notes. Please silence your cell phones, but don't put them away. We'd love you to join the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag ATLPoliticsPolicy. That's ATLPoliticsPolicy, one word. And we want everyone in the room to be part of the conversation too, so we'll have time for questions after the panels. And with that, it's my pleasure to introduce our first guest, someone who continues to play a meaningful role in crafting biosimilar and health policy on Capitol Hill. Congressman Peter Welch is a Democrat from Vermont, and he's here with my colleague, Steve Clemens. Steve is the Atlantic's Washington editor-at-large. Steve, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm going to do a little stage meeting. Hey, everybody. I can't just be, I got to sit and look at you. Hey, Peter, it's great to see you. We're actually friends through other stuff, and we won't have to bring any of that up. But you're apparently, one of the great gladiators in the drug industry. And so I'm interested in why you are tackling this. You have an act that you've introduced called the Fast Generics Act. What are you trying to do? What's the deficit you're trying to solve?
Well, it's really about affordability. I mean, there's two things. First of all, our drug industry has done extraordinary things to extend life and to alleviate pain. And in fact, I have a personal experience. My first wife, Joan, had cancer, was given a diagnosis, or that it would be 6 months to a year. She had 9 really good years, and medication made a difference in that. So that's tremendous. And biosimilars and biologics are really going to be an important next step in providing that pain relief and that life extension. But there's an ongoing challenge with pharmaceuticals in general, and it's the cost. And of course, we in this country pay the highest cost, and at a certain point, if the price is going to be really punitive to the taxpayers, to employers who are providing health insurance for their folks, and of course for copays and deductibles that individuals pay. So how do we get the balance in making these breakthroughs where you've got to do what you can to have a policy that fosters innovation, but not let there be overreach by the producers and manufacturers so that it makes it really almost impossible for people to afford them or for taxpayers to sustain it.
So your wife had cancer, her life was extended through medication. I assume cost became an issue that you were sensitive to.
Well, it's a while ago. I was sensitive to it, but my point here is this, that we have to be encouraging breakthroughs in medication, and pharma does that. Biologics and now biosimilars, which can help bring down the cost. It's kind of the generic version. is something that makes it affordable and sustainable. If you have a breakthrough drug, but the cost is so out of reach you can't afford it, then the life you save in possibility, you're going to kill folks with the price. So the Fast Generics Act that we're working on, Dave McKinley and I, is really about trying to make certain that the biologics industry has an opportunity to get the product that they need in order to reverse engineer when in effect, exclusivity period runs out. So that has the potential to save billions and billions of dollars for consumers and taxpayers, and have it be done in a way where you're not shortchanging the original inventor of that biologic. So that's the goal here.
What is that tension? Because as I really interested, right now the period of exclusivity is 12 years, and there's been some debate about lowering that to 7 years. In the TPP trade deal, if we had kind of proceeded with that, it would have been 7 years, as I understand it. But it's a fascinating tension between the sort of pharma industries and the biosimilar industries in the sense that they both need each other, in a sense that the biosimilar industry needs a healthy drug flow, if you will, and on the other hand, for the country and for everything else, for cost and for what's appropriate in the ecosystem. So where does that equilibrium need to be between the two industries? Because essentially I think what we're talking about is putting a ladder up to the existing drug or biologic, getting the data, the research that would allow the biosimilars to come along, and the more data, the more research they have, the more safe these products will be.
That's right.
So I'm interested in where that equilibrium needs to be between the two.
Well, I think there's got to be rules of the road that are strictly enforced. So, for instance, if a inventor, the company that came up with the biologic has a 12-year exclusivity period, then that is what the exclusivity period should be. Now, can they use various devices to try to extend that beyond what the 12-year exclusivity period is? Well, they do that. You know, if you're a biologic company and you're trying to do your research to have this, the biologic be an alternative to the biosimilar at a better price, you have a right to do that. So if there are obstacles that are put in your way to get the product in order for you to do the research and then be ready to go on the market on 12 years plus 1 day, then that's an obstacle. Now, the law does provide that 12 years exclusivity, so that's pretty generous in terms of patent, you know, with non-biologics or biologics at 7 years. So that patent protection is a big deal. And it is set to make certain that there is an opportunity for the company that invents this to get a solid return on its investment. And you know what? It's got to be tempting if you're sitting on a patent that's bringing in you a lot of money and it's good for your shareholders to say, you know, a few more years might not be a bad idea. So if you're that company, you like it. But I think where the balance is that we've got to strictly enforce the opportunity for the biologics industry to be on the market at the moment that exclusivity period occurs.
Do you favor going from 12 years to 7 years?
Well, I do. I think that 12 years is long. And I got to tell you, you know, I'm concerned about the price. And today, when we return, we're going to be in the Energy and Commerce Committee, and I'm going to be sponsoring an amendment there that's controversial. It's about allowing prescription drugs to be imported from Canada. And it would only be from FDA-approved.
So you're for anything that knocks the price down?
Well, it's not anything because
supporting the industries elsewhere.
Bottom line here, the safety and soundness has to be addressed. Okay, so that's not negotiable. But we have an enormous opportunity here to use the pharmaceutical industry to do what I said at the beginning, is to extend lives and to alleviate pain. That is a really, really good thing. But there has to be some acknowledgement that the taxpayer, the individual with copays and deductibles, is got to be part of the equation here. All right, it's got to be sustainable, and we've got a model in this country where the main argument for the high prices is that it allows for innovation. Now, there's some truth to that, and we've got to maintain the capacity to invest in research and development. But a lot of times that is used as an argument when it really is concealing other things. And you have everything from the mainline companies that are doing hundreds of millions of dollars of research and coming up with breakthrough products. That's fantastic. Let's keep it going. But you also have other situations where essentially Wall Street, practices, and this is the Martin Shkreli thing, where literally they see a product that has been, where the patents run out. It's $15 is what the price of the product was that Shkreli bought, and he saw that company having, in effect, a monopoly on that market, and he increased the price to $1,500. Now, that was legal. All right, that was legal. Is it right? Well, I think all of us know it isn't. So there's got to be some governmental role here to protect the consumer against overreach. And there's always, when you bring this up, some apprehension that will go too far. But we haven't gone anywhere. So the prices that people pay and the taxpayer pays in this country, as we all know, are the highest in the world.
Peter, if I may, this whole ecosystem of the various players, when we talk about, hey, there's a truth on this side, there's a truth on this side, I understand the importance of the ecosystem of having both innovation and research, and then having generics or biosimilars come in and kind of, looking at the market and how to get it right. But what I'm surprised by is the amount of, I guess, the lack of clarity. So if you talk about pricing, right, one of the things we've been learning about because of EpiPen, Martin Shkreli, is it's not all the drug price. Like if you could get biosimilars down 50, to drop the price on something 15 to 20%, you may have PBMs, you may have other issues with, distribution, you may have a lot of other pricing factors. And so what it leads you to is you've got to kind of look at the whole darn ecosystem. And this town doesn't seem to want to do that. And I'm interested in why that is. What would help when Donald Trump came out and kind of blasted the pharmaceutical industries for high drug prices? You're talking about supporting Canadian imports. How can we get a greater clarity, a greater kind of holistic treatment of that drug industry?
Two things. I met Elijah Cummings, and I met with President Trump, and he was very explicit about wanting to bring down the price and thought they were way too high.
How'd that go?
And it went pretty well, actually. I mean, we'll see what happens, okay? But it went pretty well. And he also talked on the campaign trail and to Elijah and me about importation done safely. But bottom line here, what you just asked shows how there is this pricing system that is totally opaque. So on EpiPen, for instance, the head of EpiPen was in our committee, and she was explaining how basically
Heather Bresch, right?
Heather Bresch, and if you listen to her at the end of the testimony, you started feeling sorry for Mylan because they were going broke selling EpiPens. And literally, she went through this long, convoluted deal. And at the end of it, she showed that the amount we get is very, very little, and the amount the PBMs and others get and the discounts was very, very high. So I'm just kind of scratching my head as I'm listening to this, thinking, look, I produce the EpiPen, I own the EpiPen, and I'm selling the EpiPen in a way where everybody else along the line is making way more than I am, and it's my pen. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me, so you need some transparency about that. And on EpiPen, by the way, that Mylan, which, by the way, has a wonderful facility in Vermont, that company is headquartered in the Netherlands. And if you buy the EpiPen here, it's $600. If you buy it in the Netherlands, it's $100. So the lack of transparency and clarity becomes a way to just avoid the normal function of the market because there's a lack of competition. So anything about transparency is important, and this whole PBM mechanism that we have is complicating things.
So is there any hope that we'll get kind of a greater purview of some of this? I happen to know one of the reasons why Mylan was one of the companies that went through inversion and moved from sort of Pittsburgh to the Netherlands is that Teva was trying to buy them, an Israeli drug company that hadn't paid taxes for 10 years. So they had a tax waiver, tax holiday from Israel for a certain. So when you kind of look at this, you sort of realize that it's constantly filled with non-market, wobbliness in this. And so when you kind of look at trying to get the market healthy, and look at some of it's just one of these questions I'm wondering whether or not Congress is a responsible player in that process.
Here's what happens if here, you're asking the nub of the question. Is there a role that government has to play to get the benefit of innovation and research and some protection for consumers against the almost monopoly pricing power that exists in the industry? My view is that unless government plays some constructive role, then you're going to constantly have the tendency towards higher and higher prices and anti-competitive activities. I mean, our generic manufacturers do tremendous good in helping bring prices down. Now the biosimilars industry, you have such an opportunity to help get these new medications out to people and provide that competition. What's a proper role for government? It's always been on something like this exclusivity period. There's an acknowledgement here that if you do the investment, then you're going to get a benefit of that return. But not forever, because that's essentially a monopoly pricing power situation you have. So what you need on the part of the owner of that, the company, is some restraint. You know, they've got to get a decent return, but, you know, not too much.
Have you looked at Europe? I was just listening to Chip, who announced that they just had another biosimilar approved. So 5 approved, 2 on the market. Is that right? Right. Have you looked at Europe to sort of see, I don't know what the data is, how many products are on the market, how they've done, how's safety been? Well, has that been part of your purview of? It
has to some extent, but in Europe, the government does do like price negotiation. You know, in the U.S., our VA program, they are a big purchaser of medications, and they buy wholesale,
right?
And they pay wholesale.
So
they negotiate.
All single payer, basically.
Yeah, but you're buying 100 units of aspirin when you go in the store and you look, and you're expecting that you're going to get a better price per unit than if you buy the package with 10, okay? The VA is a big buyer. In our Medicare program, which is the biggest purchaser of drugs, we made it illegal to have our Medicare program negotiate bulk price discounts. I don't think that makes much sense. And Europe doesn't do that.
One of the critiques of the industry on biosimilars is safety, and that these aren't exact drugs. They're copied drugs. They're ways to kind of come in, complex compounds doing this. So I guess in the experience of Europe, how have they met the safety test?
Well, it's similar to what we're trying to do here. I mean, one of the ways we can get, number one, we've got to guarantee safety as best as we humanly can. But number two, what we've got to have is an FDA that has adequate funding. So the biosimilars user fee agreement is extremely important, and the industry supports that, where you're going to have adequate capacity to do timely testing to guarantee that it is safe. With biosimilars, it's a little different.
Is the Trump budget friendly to that objective?
Is it friendly to any objective?
Keeping the FDA funded at the level it needs. Yeah, there you go. That's a tweetable moment. Is Scott Gottlieb friend or foe?
Friend. He can be good. You know, I got to tell you, I think one of the two areas where the president's been speaking on things where I know a lot of us would be very supportive of prescription, trying to get the price of prescription drugs down in infrastructure. And Scott Gottlieb has a pretty solid reputation. So I'm hopeful that he's going to be there playing a constructive role. You know, we've got one of the things that's holding us back here is this whole argument about whether government does or doesn't have a role. Well, of course it has a role. There's always an apprehension that we may go too far, and that's a fair concern. But there is evidence that if government doesn't play an appropriate role, industry at times can go way too far. And there's got, at the end of the day, to be an understanding that where we're paying the highest prescription drug prices in the world, and part of it is because of anti-competitive practices, stopping companies that are want to come out with biosimilars to be able to get the access to the product they need in order to do the work that must be done. That's not right. And that's where government and our agencies have to play a constructive role to help unleash the power of this industry.
Peter, before I grab a question or two from the audience, when you're in the congressional gym and you're working out with somebody, you've gone down there not because you really want to work out, but you want to. You want to seduce somebody from the dark side. Or who is the enemy of the progress you're seeking? Who are the big players that you think need to be brought over to help you achieve what you're trying to do with the Fast Generic Act? Who are the opponents?
Well, the question that you're asking actually is what's bedeviling the Congress. We're not functioning. That's a news flash, all right? But a lot of it has to do with what I was just saying, Steve. We're just on we're on our separate sides and we're just banging away at each other, where there's some acknowledgement, some of my, on any issue, but it's on this as well. There's a lot of my Republican colleagues who are concerned about the cost of drugs, but think that really all it would take, or the main thing it would take, basically, is to make the FDA approve things faster. And that could be part of it. If we're getting slowed down at the FDA, we want to get them as fast as we can, as long as at the end of the day, safety is guaranteed. But there are other issues where it does take governmental action, let's say price negotiation, or let's say rigorous enforcement of the period of exclusivity, but not one day more. That involves governmental action, and a lot of my colleagues are so hesitant about that role of government that they oppose it. And we don't just sit down, like you did in the old days, and try to come up with reasonable steps that take us one step further. And the bottom line here too is that if you own that exclusivity period, a lot of the companies that have tried to extend it through ways that are sketchy, all right? And that's not acceptable.
Is there a biosimilars caucus? There is.
Yep.
In Congress.
Over here.
You look. Yeah. Okay. Well, that's interesting. Well, we won't go there now. Let me open to the floor. Questions, comments? Yes, right here in the front. I think it's Nicholas, if my eyes are working.
Hi, Nick Florco with Inside Health Policy.
Yes.
I was wondering, your bill, the Fast Generics Act, you already mentioned that you're going to support a Canadian importation amendment for user fees, correct? And I'm wondering, is there any attaching it to user fees, correct?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So I'm wondering if there's any hope of getting the Fast Generics Act included in the UFAs, either in committee or on the floor. And second of all, I'm wondering the steps that Scott Gottlieb laid out recently to increase generic competition, namely publishing a list of off-patent generic drugs and having a meeting on REMS of uses. Do you think that's enough to really encourage generic competition, or do more stringent enforcement mechanisms like your bill, are those needed?
Great questions.
Two things. I think it's unlikely we'd be able to get this bill, that bill added to the UFA legislation. I'm not sure that it's germane, but I don't see that happening. And there's a desire to get that UFA bill passed because we all need that. Number two, I think we need the Fast Generics Act. I really do. I think that it would provide some funding and some teeth and ultimately some savings. But I think it would be really important to get the potential of our biologics industry boosted. And third, I'm really happy with what Scott Gottlieb is proposing, and it's a start, but it's not the end.
Interesting. Other quick question. Yeah, right here in the back.
Hi, Steve Knievel from Public Citizen. I wanted to thank you, Representative Welch, for your leadership in the Fast Generics Act, as well as being a co-sponsor of the Improving Access to Affordable Prescription Drugs Act. And I wanted to ask you, like you mentioned, President Trump spoke on the campaign trail and since becoming president about the need for Medicare to negotiate prescription drug prices. Why don't you think he's moved in that direction so far, and what do you think civil society and members of Congress can do to move him in that direction?
Citizen do. Thank you.
Well, I don't know why the president hasn't moved on that. When we met with him, what I said to the president, because he was very explicit that he favored that and knowledgeable about it, okay? I said, you're going to run into a wall of opposition on your side. Tom Price was sitting next to me, and I looked over to him, and I said, Tom. So there's opposition there. The other thing is the president's busy guy with other things that weren't necessarily on the agenda. So I actually think that takes away some time and attention from a lot of things that he'd like to work on. So that may be an issue. But I got to be hopeful here, all right? I think the president, when he spoke to us in his campaign and afterwards, spoke with clarity about this, number one. Number two, I think he gets the politics of this. Keep in mind, we're sitting here in Washington. People desperately need these medications, all right? They need them. They know they need them, and they appreciate what the industry is doing to create them. But if you kill folks with the price, it just creates this existential anxiety for people. It's real. And, you know, when you're in Congress and you're going home, and I have Vermonters who cannot figure out how they're going to afford it, but they can cross the border into Canada and then get it and afford it, there's such relief. So we've got to understand that this burden on our individuals, our neighbors, and our taxpayers, the budgets of states, that's real. And we've got to try to just be reasonable on it. So we're going to keep banging away. And I know a lot of my Republican colleagues feel this. You know, Dave McKinley is from West Virginia, coal country, and I went down there into a coal mine with him. But his folks, you know, they're no different than Vermonters. And they know they need this. It's the hardest one. It's like a parent and for a child, or a husband for a wife, and you know, your partner. So that's real. And we've got to just make that front and center our concern.
Well, Peter, thank you so much for your time and for your seriousness, for being with us and talking with us today. Good luck with your hearing.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, Congressman Peter Welch, thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve and Congressman Welch. Across the street from the Capitol, a patent case in front of the Supreme Court could impact the biologic and biosimilar market. The case, Amgen versus Sandoz, is raising a number of questions about how our patent and intellectual property rules are influencing the U.S. market for biological drugs. This is complex stuff, and here to break it down for us, I'm pleased to welcome Phil Nixon, Associate General Counsel of IP at Momenta Pharmaceuticals, a generic and biosimilar company. And Momenta Pharmaceuticals is a member of the Biosimilars Council. Bruce Artime, Senior Director of Federal Government Affairs for the pharmaceutical company manufacturer Eli Lilly and Company. And Courtney Brinkerhoff, a partner at the law firm Foley & Lardner. Courtney is the editor and primary author of the firm's Pharma Patents blog and is an expert in life sciences IP. And here to lead the conversation is Olga Kazan, staff writer at The Atlantic. So Olga, over to you.
Thanks, everyone, and thank you guys for being here today. Why don't we start with you, Courtney, and with a little overview of the Amgen versus Sandoz case and what's at stake.
Sure. So the Amgen versus Sandoz case arose surrounding the first biosimilar to be approved by the FDA. And it raises two issues for the Supreme Court to decide. The first is whether the patent dispute resolution procedures of the biosimilar statute are optional. That is, whether the biosimilar applicant has to share its application with the originator and go through the steps of what we call the patent dance in order to figure out the first round of patent litigation, or whether the biosimilar applicant can decide not to participate in that process, keep its application confidential, and leave it to the originator to detect or find out about the biosimilar application and decide on its own which patents might be infringed. On the second issue relates to the pre-marketing notice requirement, and that's a requirement that the biosimilar applicant give 180 days notice to the originator before they begin marketing their biosimilar. And the question on that issue is whether that notice can be given before the biosimilar is approved or cannot be given until the approval is obtained.
So, and they both kind of hinge on sort of seemingly minute but actually pretty important issues, right? So one is, isn't the word shall really important in this?
Yeah, it's very interesting on both issues. Shall comes up, and the Federal Circuit decided that shall does not really mean shall in the first issue, but shall does mean shall in the second issue. So on the first issue, the statute does say that the biosimilar applicant shall share their application with the originator. But the statute also imposes consequences for not sharing the application, and that's where the court found some leeway in shall not being mandatory.
Oh, makes perfect sense. And then why is it important whether the 6-month window, why is that an important window?
So that's a really important window to all parties and to the public because that determines when consumers and patients can actually start receiving the biosimilar drugs. As it stands now, the you have to wait for approval to give the notice and then wait that 6 months before marketing. So that essentially, keeps the drug off the market for 6 more months after the FDA has approved it.
Okay, well, why don't we get a take from the stakeholders here? What is your respective takes on the patent dance? Advantages, disadvantages?
Well, one thing I will say, first of all, I think on the patent dance, I think the expectation of those who drafted and who participated in the long public debate, and unlike many elements of the Affordable Care Act, this is probably the most fully vetted aspect. It enjoyed bipartisan support over a long period of time. And so I think and it really involves the trade-off between what are the right set of incentives for the innovator. And remember, before there's a biosimilar, there has to be a biologic. And so the Congress acted in certain ways, for example, the 12 years of data protection to foster the next generation of innovative products. And so I think the expectation of all those who participated is, with respect to the patent dance, you've got to face the music. I mean, this came with it. And so, yes, I think there are some interpretations that the Federal Circuit made that, I suspect is news to those who are most involved in the debate. And even though Justice Scalia is no longer with us and he took a dim view of legislative history, I think that, it's sort of surprising to anyone involved that this is an issue. So on that aspect, I think shall meant shall, and we wait for these contemporaneous statements during the debates that this was just a discretionary system. I just think it's a great surprise. And remember. What we really want to accomplish, we believe, is to make sure that both of the sectors are adequately, the rights are preserved. And so for the innovator, it seems to me that the Congress certainly didn't want to have the innovator put in this position where all of a sudden there's these surprise attacks on patents. It's supposed to be an orderly system. There'd be notice. We could discuss these issues way before the patents expired, and that seemed to be part and parcel of the system.
And Phil, what's your take?
So Momenta is a biosimilar company. I think for the biosimilar business, choice is a good thing. I wasn't there for the bipartisan debate on whether or not this pathway is optional. I think if the pathway was required, there wouldn't be the remedies that were acknowledged by the court. And so, there is music to be faced, whether that be a patent litigation or a DJ action brought by the other side. I think, when we say patent expirations here, that we need to separate those patents that protect new cures from those that are designed to, delay patient access to biosimilars. There are certain patents out there for certain molecules that I think we would all agree don't protect new cures, but are rather designed to delay patient access through abuse of litigation and various other strategies. So I think with respect to optionality, it's case by case, and choice is a good thing.
Tell us what it already takes for a biosimilar to come to market. What do you have to do to get through the FDA, get through everything, all the red tape?
Is that for me?
Yeah.
To be determined. Again, I think choice is a good thing, and the road is long, and there's a lot of work to be done. As of right now, what we've seen is people doing fairly expansive clinical studies. Momenta has a slightly different position to that, and we'll wait and see how that plays out.
But what's the argument for making it an easier path for biosimilars?
What is the argument for making it an easier path?
Yeah.
I think patient access is key here. I think the safety is critical. We certainly agree with that. I'm not sure easiness is what we're looking for here, but certainly clarity would be important.
Okay.
If I could just jump in there, I think, as I understand the balance, similar to Hatch-Waxman, I think, even though the data that we're talking about was trade secret, it was protected for an infinite amount of time until this Biosimilars Act came into existence, similarly to the way when the Hatch-Waxman law came to existence
for small molecules. And I think the societal trade-off is, what's a fair period of return for the innovator before we hand it off to the less expensive generic or biosimilar copies? That's really, I think, the global question. So I think the trade-off is, how do we get the sufficient incentives on the innovator side, and we can then allow these other products to come on the market, which are more cost available to patients. I think that's the basic public policy balancing. And one point I want to make about the patent dance in this particular piece of legislation, because of the way it unfolded, it really didn't get these provisions that has Justice Breyer and others really scratching their heads. What do they mean? It never got the full normal process of Congress. What happened was in 2007, in the Senate Health Committee, this bipartisan bill was marked up. In the next Congress, it was taken up, and this is during the time that is an interesting set of events where Senator Kennedy gets sick. This is actually the last major bill he worked on with Senator Hatch. He voted in favor of this bill. There was a parallel set of legislation occurring in the House with Congresswoman Eshoo and Mr. Joe Barton and Mr. Inslee. Because of Senator Kennedy's untimely death, what was passed was actually the 2007 version in many respects. And so we never really had the House, I think the House sponsor said, well, hey, let's stick with what the Senate did. That's a bipartisan bill. We never had this conference, and only because of the unique circumstance of the way the reconciliation rules, the Congress had to sort of take this language or leave it. And so I think in a more normal system, I think this language would have been refined, so you wouldn't have Justice Breyer sort of almost pleading, well, can the FDA get us out of this? Can the FDA fill in some of these gaps? I think the normal ping-ponging in a complex IP law just didn't take place. And I think on this particular issue, and as we're probably going to go through many others, where the courts are struggle with language that probably could have used some more refinement.
Well, Bruce, can you help us understand, I mean, just from your perspective, I think a lot of times when pharmaceutical companies say they need longer patent protections, that's difficult for everyday people to understand. Why is that important to pharmaceutical companies? Well,
at first, I don't think we want longer patent protection. Our Congress and the rest of the world got together in the GATT Treaty to say that patents should be at least 20 years. And it turns out that in our domestic law, under the Hatch-Waxman, which applies both to drugs and biologics, the cap is really 14 years. And so for some of the most important products in the economy, it's, we don't get the 20-year because the development time for our products, which can go 10 to 15 years, can cost $2.6 billion. We are actually treated not as well as we're not treated as well as the cop killer bullets that put people into emergency rooms. And if you want to take our products to help cure you, we actually have less patent protection. So we think what we need is a fair amount of dependable patent terms. So I don't think it's longer than what is expected elsewhere in the economy. We talk about a unitary patent system. Patents, we don't pick and choose winners and losers in terms of length of patent. So we would like to see a system where we're assured of a reasonable amount of time, which I think in our system since 1984, this 14-year period is something that's once again agreed to in a bipartisan fashion.
And what do you think of the American exclusivity period versus the one in Europe?
I mean, so it's important to note when that exclusivity period runs from, right? It runs from when the company chooses to file its application. So I think, historically when biologics haven't had any competition, patents were filed earlier, maybe out of universities. I think that can be addressed by prosecution strategies within organizations now that we know what's ahead of us. I know that, the 12 years of regulatory exclusivity was intensely debated by bipartisan, I assume, and it could have been more, could have been less, but that's where we landed. Coincides, coincidentally, I think, with the expiration of most of the patents that cover the new cures, the composition matter, the new indications. So to me, it seems right.
But aren't they usually shorter in Europe, though? The patent periods?
No, 20 years.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
I just want to make one comment on the patent strategy, since that's my bread and butter. There is limited ability to delay filing your patent application to provide its life or to coordinate its life with the approved product, because we're in a first to file system. So the longer you wait to file your patent application, the more likely it is that you won't be able to obtain it at all. And especially when we have research done in public agencies and universities where the professors have to publish, you have to file your patent application before any publications can be made. So it's actually quite difficult to hold on to your technology and file your application later.
I did want to ask about, are there any safety issues that do come up with biosimilars? And anyone and everyone can weigh in.
Well, the one thing I will say, I think there's some that have sort of argued that the sky is falling and these products can't be made safely. And I think when you look at the quality of the firms that are entering this market, I think we're going to have reasonable certainty of safety of these products. Sandoz is obviously a first-class manufacturing entity. I start my day with 2 generic drugs every morning, and I think. I think generally speaking, I think we can rely on the manufacturers, and we can, most important, I think, rely on the FDA oversight. But having said all that, I think it's also the case that reverse engineering producing a small molecule drug is different than producing a biologic. And from time to time, there will be issues. There's this famous incident with Johnson & Johnson with one of their cleaning agents for some of their corks contaminated a batch of their biologics. So from time to time, there will be safety issues, but we would hope and expect, like with generic drugs, that patients can take a biosimilar with absolutely the same type of certainty that you get from you would expect from any medical product regulated by the FDA.
You want to weigh in on that?
I mean, I haven't personally seen any data on adverse events for a biosimilar that's different for that of the brand biologic. I think it's an important issue, but I haven't seen any data yet.
I think one thing that's interesting about this field, because of the complexity of the technology, we have companies on both sides of the equation. So Amgen is the originator in the Amgen v. Sandoz case, but they are also developing biosimilars of other people's products. So I think that speaks to the complexity of the technology, that it's harder for companies to have the know-how and the facilities to generate them. But it also makes these issues very interesting because you have the same companies on both sides of all the issues.
If I could just quickly jump in, I didn't hear all of Congressman Welch's comments because I was in the hallway, but to the extent, I think one area I think there is concern about is imported drug products, both drugs and biologics, I think raises a different set of questions. I think just yesterday, the day before, I think former FBI director, I think issued a report, which I believe that pharma subsidized the report, but he found, he's a man of great integrity, but he also noted that there's increased risk of safety, and it could put a drain on law enforcement. There's issues there when you start importing drugs that maybe the FDA can't regulate all drugs at the same level of rigor from overseas. But I don't think that's specific to biosimilars. I think that's, I think we have significant concerns. I think the public has significant concerns about safety of imported drug products.
Well, I want to get to audience Q&A in a couple minutes, but first, is this an effective way to bring down drug prices? Are biosimilars sort of one way? I mean, we have this spiraling prescription drug costs in the U.S. I think the FDA commissioner has signaled that generics might be one way to contain that. Is this an effective strategy? Anyone?
My answer is yes, I hope so. As I say, as a person that takes generic medicines, but I think that the GAO does this running tally of savings, and I believe it's from 2004 to 2015. It's a running 10-year total that off-patent medicines, generic versions, have saved consumers $1.1 trillion, 1.1 trillion with a T dollars. And so I think when the biosimilar system comes fully up and running with more products, I think we're going to see the savings achieved to the system. And I think that's a good thing. And I think from our standpoint is we want to be sure that we have a fair period of time on the front end for innovative products to be rewarded for our efforts. So yes, we think that it should produce some savings.
Do you have a take on that?
I agree. I think it should produce some savings. I also think that I'm hopeful that it will drive innovation, drive new drugs.
How would it do that?
Competition causes people to run harder. So I think as biosimilars come on the market, I think we will see brand organizations look to develop new products to essentially maintain their revenue streams.
Okay, great. Do we have any audience questions? They're coming around with mics.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm Susan Campbell with Women Heart, the National Coalition for Women with Heart Disease. And I wonder if you would comment on the scenario that Congressman Welch talked about with the Mylan executive explaining how the high prices that they charge really aren't the high prices that they charge because of the whole chain from designing and producing the drug to getting it in a pill box. There's a lot of costs along the way. And for some reason that we just don't seem to be able to get a handle through the lack of transparency on where those charges actually accrue. And I'm wondering if anyone could talk about that.
Let's make a comment. I know that next week, I think in the Senate Help Committee, there's going to be a hearing on exactly that topic. And I think one of the issues are, how much the middlemen in the system consume. And so one, I think the great public policy debates now is the types of discounts and rebates that innovator companies pay in order to get onto formularies. And so what role the PBMs have and what role the insurance companies have that with insurance designs that make people pay more out of pocket, first dollar costs and deductibles. And I think one of the things that we've done as a company, and I think other companies are also starting to do, is how do we figure out how to pass off that discount directly to the consumer. So we work with the PBM through Blink Health, and I won't name our products, but I think you can go into directly and get the same type of 30 to 40% discount that we make with the insurance company, that a consumer can get that directly. And I think this is part of what will happen hopefully over the next couple of years as each role and respective responsibility of the players in this complex system become more apparent. But it is a very difficult system for many people to navigate, particularly even in choosing their insurance plan. When I was young and very healthy, working for the federal government, I just wanted to know what was the cheapest health plan. And so sometimes the cheapest, the lowest price premium is not the best plan if you know what your health needs are. And so if you choose a plan that has a high prescription deductible, then you're going to pay during the course of the year. One of the anomalies that we don't quite understand is why is it, even though the rebate is going to the insurance company, people are paying list price, even though insured people are paying list price until they exhaust the deductible. And that seems to be a cause of great concern. I experienced that myself my first time I filled my medicines, and the guy next to me saying, I paid $80 for these in November, it's the end of January, and now it's $300. What's going on? Well, what's going on is you're paying list price for a product that that you have a deductible for.
Just the follow-up is, why is there a discount price? Why isn't there just the price?
It's a great question, because I think the answer is, and it's interesting because one of the things that we hear, the government should negotiate prices, and the government should negotiate prices. We have a portfolio of products. We engage with pharmacy benefit managers. Their job is to try to get the lowest price for the members of the public that they insure. And so what we do is we offer a set of discounts. So if I have a diabetes product and Momenta has a diabetes product, they're going to say, hey, I will, how much discount will you give me? And then the question is, I think, how much of that is passed on to the patient? But I think they try to set up competitive bidding, and the list price is just where the bidding starts. In the same way, if you look at the back of the door of the hotel has a price, but if you go onto a website with hotel rooms, you'll see competitive bidding, that far lower than the list price. So it's sort of a going in position.
Anyone else? Over here.
Good morning. My name's Adamola. I'm with the National Community Pharmacists Association. The question I wanted to ask is, I think we need to think about our motivations here who really gets hurt at the end of the day, which are the patients. And talking about PBMs and things like that, just can anybody elaborate on the role that they think PBMs should play? And are we going to push the transparency for them to just, I mean, what needs to be done for that to happen, you know? Or are we just going to keep talking about it? And at the end of the day, like I said, the patients are the ones suffering. Think about the EpiPen and things like that. You can't blame Mylan for raising the price because they're trying to make a profit on their product, just like it was said earlier. So can anybody just elaborate on that? Where there's a balanced role that everyone plays so the patient can get the care that they need, which is what we're all here for. So.
I'll just make one comment. With respect to the PBMs, I think that their role is becoming, I think more under public discussion, which is probably a good thing, but they do play a vital role in the system because it would be hard for us to negotiate with every individual pharmacy, every community pharmacy in the country. I think the question is, how much what's the fair value of their service? What's the fair, how do you make sure it's appropriately taken into account of? Because one of the things that we've done lately as a company in terms of transparency, in our last quarterly statement, we publicly declare what our net price increase is, which is a lot lower than these double-digit list price increases that is fueling a lot of the public debate. I think we're at about 2.3% is what we're actually realizing after these rebates and discounts. And I think, as a matter of fact, I think if you just search some of the literature, I think what we're actually realizing as a company and other companies is a lot less dramatic than some of the headlines suggest on the list price increase. And I think it's a fair question. Where's that where those monies flowing to, I think is a question. I think that's one of the things that the Health Committee is going to look at next week.
Did you have a question over here? Yeah.
Sure. Hi, I'm Shannon. I'm with MedPage today. I had a question about the efficacy aspects. I've spoken with some oncologists who are concerned about the accelerated approval, not so much because of safety issues, but because they're concerned that the analytical evaluation that happens in that process de-emphasizes the clinical side of the approval pathway. And they may be less apt to switch to a biosimilar from a biologic. Can you talk a little bit about efficacy and switching and how manufacturers can assure physicians that these drugs will be as effective as the biologic? Thank you.
So, fair question. I think, at Momenta, we believe in the value of analytics and balancing that with the clinical burden. Our position is that you can use analytics to show that something is the same, essentially. That you can characterize the wazoo out of the molecule and the mixture that the molecule is in. And I think if you can get to that place, you could then view a biosimilar as essentially akin to a small molecule, right? If the thing is the same, why would you expect any difference relative to the brand? So, I'm not saying that, clinical data won't be important, but I think that it can be balanced with, analytics.
Do you think will you be pursuing interchangeable designations or simply biosimilars with your own additional backup data?
To be determined.
Well, we have a little bit of time left, and I wanted to just do a quick lightning round. I wanted to know kind of what is number one on everyone's wish list for these patent issues related to biosimilars. What's the number one thing that could happen that you feel like would really clarify the issue, potentially in your favor? And Courtney, maybe we can start with you, and you can speak for your clients since you don't really have a stake in this.
Sure. I think the most likely outcome from the Supreme Court is to leave the patent dance procedures optional. And we are seeing biosimilars opting into them and not opting into them on a case-by-case basis. And I think, as much as the originators expected them to be mandatory, I think the court at least would leave it like that. And perhaps if that's not satisfactory, let them go back to Congress. I think on the second issue, it's much trickier. I think there's a lot of sort of public interest in believing that the product should be able to be marketed as soon as it's approved. So I think that's a trickier issue on how they'll decide, because the statute is pretty black and white, but the expectation again was different.
I'll just quickly take the other side on the, if the court reaches the first question on the merits, I think that since the Federal Circuit seems to be overturned by the Supreme Court with some regularity, I think that the Supreme Court will conclude, I think rightly, that shall meet shall. I also think it's possible they may dismiss this case as improvidently granted, given some of the complexities and the angst that was expressed by some of the justices. But for us, I think the most important issue we face, believe it or not, in biosimilars and all of our patent litigation, I think our number one concern right now is the patent challenge system under the new patent bill in the AIA called Inter Partes Review, IPR, where you can the standard of evidence at the administrative proceeding at the PTO is lower. It's preponderance of evidence than it's been used in the federal courts, which is clear and convincing evidence. So I think to us, our number one concern is the difference of the way the reviews take place at the PTO versus in the federal courts. And we prefer the time-honored system of the federal courts. We have a case right now where we've won in the Federal Circuit Court of Appeals, and now it's under review at the PTO with this lesser standard.
Responding to that, I actually think IPRs are a good thing for the biosimilar business. I think is what's good for the goose here. So I think we all agree that.
But why should it be a lower standard than the federal courts? Why would that be? Why would we not give deference to, after, we just talked about the $2.6 billion that we invest, and it's not at the time, mostly at the invention, it's the preclinical and clinical trials. We've relied on the patent. We've succeeded. We're one of the 8 drugs that meet clinical trial that gets approved, one of the 2 in 10 that gets approved that actually makes its money back. And then somebody comes in, and after all this reliance, they say, let's redo this case with preponderance of evidence. So let's flip the coin, or let's put, the scale with one feather on one side. Why should that be the rule? That seems unfair to us.
Why should the rule be different for biologics than it should be any other patent holder?
Well, no, it shouldn't. It shouldn't be for biologics. We think for drugs and biologic, the rules should be clear and convincing evidence. It's clear. That's what it is for every other patent in the federal courts.
But every other patent is also subject to IPR. Why should we exclude? I think what you're suggesting is that we should not use IPRs for biologics.
No, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying I think the IPR rules itself, the standard of evidence, ought to be reviewed.
So I think,
as a matter of fact, we've been both on both sides of IPRs. I mean, I think that we've used the system. We've been tested under the system.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the delta and the standard reviews, we're splitting hairs there, right? I guess where I am is, I think the dawn of biosimilars is a good thing, right? We all agree that they will result in increased patient access to these important medicines. I think we're witnessing the birth of a new business here, and with that, there's a lot of uncertainty. You look at Hatch-Waxman, it kind of followed the same path. I think what would be good for everybody here would be increased certainty. The Supreme Court can certainly weigh into that by opining on these 2 questions on the table. And I think with that increased certainty, we will get to, a more streamlined way to have these biosimilars hit the market.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Courtney Brinkerhoff, Phil Nixon, and Bruce Artem. Yeah, sorry. Thanks so much, guys.
Thank you to Olga, Steve, and all of our speakers for the discussion this morning, and a very big thank you to the Biosimilars Council for making today's event and our entire series possible. One request before you leave: you'll get an email from me with a survey, and there are also hard copies here in the room, so please take a moment to fill those out. Your feedback is important to us. You all have been a great audience today. We appreciate your taking the time to join us, and have a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you.